The year was 1861. America, divided, bleeding, and on the edge of collapse. The Union needed leaders, but the men who would rise to the challenge weren't legends yet. They were ordinary officers, untested, uncertain, and often unprepared for what was coming. But through 4 years of blood and chaos, these generals would forge their names in fire. Some would become heroes, others cautionary tales. All would carry the weight of a nation's survival on their shoulders. This is the story of 15 Union generals, how they won, how they failed, and how they saved the United States of America. 1. Ulysses S. Grant, the relentless general. Grant's war didn't begin in glory, it began in failure. Before the Civil War, he was a disgraced officer, forced out of the army and selling firewood to survive. But when the Union called, Grant answered and changed history. At Fort Donelson, he showed the first sign of his steel. When the Confederates asked for terms, he demanded unconditional surrender. It was bold, shocking, and exactly what the Union needed. At Shiloh, his men were caught off guard, losing thousands in a surprise attack. But Grant refused to retreat. By the second day, he counterattacked and turned disaster into victory. Then came Vicksburg, his masterpiece. He marched his army deep into Mississippi, cut his own supply lines, and besieged the fortress city until it starved into surrender. That victory split the Confederacy in two and made Grant a national hero. But Grant's greatest strength, relentless offense, was also his flaw. At Cold Harbor, his frontal assaults cost over 7,000 Union lives in less than an hour. He earned the nickname the Butcher. Yet Grant understood something few others did. The war would only end when the Confederacy's armies were destroyed. He took that burden personally. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The quiet man from Ohio had done the impossible. He succeeded because he refused to stop. He failed only in how many men it cost to win. 2. William T. Sherman. The fire that broke the South. If Grant was the hammer, Sherman was the torch. He saw war for what it truly was, not a game of honor, but a machine of destruction. Early in the war, he suffered a mental breakdown, overwhelmed by the scale of chaos. Many thought he was finished, but when he returned, he came back with fire in his eyes. In Atlanta, he crushed Confederate defenses, then burned the city to deny it to the enemy. And when he began his march to the sea, he turned total war into strategy. Sherman's army carved a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across Georgia, not just burning railroads and factories, but breaking the South's will to fight. He didn't just defeat armies. He destroyed morale, supply, and hope. His success lay in understanding psychological warfare. His failure? The legacy of terror his tactics left behind. To this day, in the South, his name is still cursed. But to the Union, Sherman was the man who ended the war without another Gettysburg. 3. George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud. But when everything collapsed, George Thomas stood his ground. At Chickamauga, Union forces were in full retreat. Panic spread, lines broke, but not Thomas. He held his position for hours against overwhelming Confederate assaults, saving the entire Army of the Cumberland from destruction. That's how he earned his name, the Rock of Chickamauga. Later at Nashville, Thomas delivered one of the most complete victories of the war, annihilating Hood's army in a perfectly executed assault. He planned carefully, struck decisively, and won utterly. But Thomas's flaw was caution. He waited too long to move, too long to attack, too long to take risks. Grant, frustrated, called him slow, and history largely forgot him. Yet among soldiers, Thomas was revered, a man of iron discipline and quiet courage, who fought for the Union even as his own Virginia family sided with the Confederacy. 4. George G. Meade, the victor forgotten. Few men have ever taken command under more pressure. Just 3 days before Gettysburg, Meade was handed control of the Army of the Potomac. He barely had time to unpack his maps before facing Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. For 3 brutal days, Meade held firm, through Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, and Pickett's Charge. When the smoke cleared, Lee's army was retreating south. It was the most important Union victory of the war. But Meade's failure came immediately after. He didn't pursue Lee. He let the Confederate army escape across the Potomac. Lincoln was furious, calling it a golden opportunity wasted. Meade had won the greatest battle on American soil, and yet he was overshadowed by the man who came after him, Ulysses S. Grant. His legacy faded in Grant's shadow, but historians still call him what he truly was, the man who stopped the Confederacy's last great hope. 5. Philip Sheridan, the lightning cavalryman. Sheridan brought speed and aggression to a new level. Short, fiery, and full of fight, he turned cavalry into a weapon of mass destruction. In the Shenandoah Valley, his campaign was pure devastation. He burned barns, crops, and railroads, crippling the Confederacy's breadbasket. At Cedar Creek, when his army was surprised and nearly routed, Sheridan famously rode 20 miles to the front, rallied his men, and turned defeat into victory. His energy was unmatched. Sheridan's men idolized him. His enemies feared him. But that aggression had a dark side. After the war, his ruthless tactics continued in the West against Native Americans, leaving a brutal legacy that still divides historians. He was the embodiment of total war, lightning fast, merciless, and unstoppable. 6. Winfield Scott, the old soldier's plan. He never led a single Civil War battle. He was too old, too sick, and too heavy to mount a horse. But Winfield Scott might have been the smartest general of them all. At the war's start, he devised a plan that most politicians mocked: blockade the South's ports, control the Mississippi River, and squeeze the Confederacy until it suffocated. They called it the Anaconda Plan, and they laughed at him. But 4 years later, that exact strategy won the war. Grant took the Mississippi. Sherman cut through Georgia. The Navy's blockade strangled the South. Scott saw the big picture: total war before anyone else did. His failure was only that he was too old to carry it out himself. But in strategy, not bullets, he helped save the Union. 7. Winfield S. Hancock, the soldier's soldier. Handsome, fearless, and admired by everyone who served under him, Winfield Scott Hancock was the epitome of a battlefield general. At Gettysburg, when the Union center began to crumble under Pickett's charge, Hancock rode into the storm. Cannonballs exploded around him, bullets tore through the air, but he stayed on his horse, directing men calmly under fire. He was shot and nearly killed, but refused to leave until the battle was won. Hancock's success was leadership through courage. His presence alone could turn panic into pride. His failure came later, in politics. He ran for president, but the nation remembered soldiers differently than it did politicians. Still, his men called him the Superb, a commander who led from the front and never asked of his men what he wouldn't do himself. 8. George B. McClellan, the brilliant disappointment. Few generals were as loved by their men or as infuriating to their president as George B. McClellan. He took over a chaotic, demoralized army after Bull Run and turned it into the Army of the Potomac, organized, disciplined, and well-trained. His soldiers adored him, calling him Little Mac. But McClellan's genius for organization was matched only by his paralysis in command. He overestimated the enemy at every turn, convinced that Robert E. Lee had twice as many men. On the Peninsula Campaign, he crawled toward Richmond at a snail's pace, giving Lee time to strike again and again. At Antietam, McClellan actually had Lee's battle plans, literally wrapped around a cigar, yet still moved too slowly. It became the bloodiest day in American history. Lee escaped, the war dragged on, and Lincoln lost patience. McClellan succeeded in building the army that won the war, but failed to use it to end the war. He could prepare for victory, but never pull the trigger. 9. Joseph Hooker, the overconfident reformer. Fighting Joe. Hooker was everything McClellan wasn't: bold, loud, and sure of himself. When he took command in 1863, the Army of the Potomac was demoralized. Hooker reformed it from the ground up. Better food, medical care, intelligence, and morale. He built a force ready to crush the Confederacy. But at Chancellorsville, that confidence turned to disaster. Lee, outnumbered 2-1, divided his army and attacked. Hooker froze. Stunned by the enemy's audacity, he lost control of the battle and his army retreated in chaos. His reforms strengthened the Union Army, but his ego and indecision destroyed his chance at greatness. Hooker talked like a conqueror, but hesitated when it mattered most. 10. Ambrose Burnside, the loyal but unlucky. No one wanted to command the Army of the Potomac after so many failures. Ambrose Burnside took the job. Out of loyalty, not ambition. He was brave, kind, and utterly devoted to the Union cause. But courage wasn't enough to save him from one of the worst disasters of the war. Fredericksburg. He ordered wave after wave of Union soldiers to charge a fortified Confederate position behind a stone wall. It was slaughter. 12,000 Union casualties in a single day. His men respected his honesty and bravery, but pitied his leadership. Later at the crater near Petersburg, Burnside's innovative plan, using explosives to blow a hole in Confederate lines, was ruined by poor execution and political interference. Again, thousands died. He succeeded in loyalty and heart, yet failed in judgment and command. A tragic figure who carried his soldiers' respect, but not their victories. 11. John A. Logan. The People's General. John A. Logan wasn't a career soldier. He was a politician. But when war broke out, he left Congress, picked up a sword, and led from the front. At Belmont, Vicksburg, and Atlanta, Logan proved himself a natural leader. He inspired his men not with rank, but with presence. At Atlanta, when General McPherson was killed, Logan took command amid chaos, rallying the men, reorganizing lines, and holding the field. He refused to let the army break. Logan's success was built on charisma and raw courage, not tactics from West Point, but instincts from the heart. His failure was simply that he wasn't part of the inner circle of Grant and Sherman. He never got the command his leadership deserved, but to the soldiers who followed him, he was one of them, a man who led from the smoke and dirt, not from behind the lines. 12. John Pope. The boastful strategist. John Pope came east with swagger and promises. He'd been successful in the Western Theater, capturing Island No. 10 on the Mississippi. Lincoln hoped he'd bring that same energy to Virginia. But Pope was a man who talked more than he planned. He mocked the cautious Eastern generals, saying his headquarters would be in the saddle. Then came Second Bull Run. Lee and Jackson outmaneuvered him completely. His army was crushed, his reputation shattered. Pope's arrogance had blinded him to Lee's cunning. After the defeat, he was quietly reassigned to the frontier. Far from the headlines, he succeeded as a bold strategist out west, but failed because he underestimated the genius of the enemy in the east. 13. Lew Wallace, the redeemed general. Lew Wallace is best known today as the author of Ben-Hur, but before that, he was a soldier trying to earn redemption. At Shiloh, his division arrived late to the battle, costing the Union thousands of casualties. Grant blamed him, and Wallace carried that stain for years. But in 1864, fate gave him a second chance. At Monocacy, Wallace and a small force of 6,000 men faced 15,000 Confederates marching toward Washington, D.C. He knew he couldn't win, but he fought anyway, delaying the Confederates for an entire day. That bought just enough time for reinforcements to save the capital. Monocacy became known as the battle that saved Washington. Lew Wallace redeemed himself in one act of courage, proving that even failure can lead to legacy. 14. John G. Foster. The engineer behind the victories. John G. Foster wasn't a battlefield star. He was the man who made victories possible. A West Point engineer and veteran of Mexico, Foster specialized in fortifications and siege warfare. He built defenses, bridges, and supply lines that made campaigns like Sherman's March and the Carolina offensives even possible. At New Bern and Charleston, his careful planning and engineering skill led to rare early Union victories. He was rarely in the spotlight, but his fingerprints were everywhere, from rail lines to artillery positions. He succeeded by outthinking the enemy long before a shot was fired. His failure was being overshadowed by the flashier, louder generals, the ones who made headlines, not history books. 15. David Hunter, the radical general. General David Hunter was one of the war's most controversial figures and one of its most courageous thinkers. While others fought only to preserve the Union, Hunter fought to destroy slavery. In 1862, he issued an order freeing all enslaved people in his military district, before Lincoln himself had written the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln rescinded the order, but Hunter's act forced the issue into national debate. Militarily, Hunter had mixed results. His campaign in the Shenandoah failed against Confederate General Jubal Early, but his leadership in recruiting and commanding black regiments changed the face of the Union Army. Hunter's success was moral, not military. He fought for a cause larger than victory, for freedom itself. His failure was in tactics, but his courage changed the purpose of the war forever. 15 men, different backgrounds, temperaments, and destinies, but bound by one impossible task: preserving a nation tearing itself apart. Grant, relentless. Sherman, destructive genius. Thomas, immovable rock. Sheridan, thunder on horseback. Meade, the victor forgotten. Scott, the strategist before his time. Hancock, the hero of Gettysburg. McClellan, the builder who wouldn't strike. Hooker, the reformer who froze. Burnside, loyal but doomed. Logan, the fighter of the people. Pope, the prideful who fell. Wallace, the redeemed. Foster, the mind behind the lines. Hunter, the moral crusader. Together they carried the weight of freedom, and through victory and failure alike, they proved one truth: the Union did not survive because of perfection. It survived because men refused to stop fighting for it. The Civil War made legends and left scars that never healed. But these were the generals who turned defeat into determination and chaos into a nation reborn. Which is your favorite and why? Like and subscribe for more unearthed history.